Italian businessman Alessandro Romano was rushing to his hotel when he heard something that made him freeze in his tracks. A homeless woman sitting outside the entrance was speaking perfect Italian, not broken phrases, but eloquent, educated Italian that reminded him of his grandmother's stories. When he approached her, asking how she learned his language, her answer about studying literature at the University of Florence left him speechless. What he didn't know was that this woman held the key to a promise his family had made decades ago. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Fifth Avenue as Alessandro Romano stepped out of his black Mercedes, his mind already racing through the evening's agenda. At 45, he had built Romano Industries into one of Italy's most successful technology companies, but success had taught him that every minute counted. His phone buzzed with notifications from his Milan office, and he barely glanced up as his driver pulled away from the curb. But then he heard it, a voice that made him stop mid-stride. La sera è troppo bella per essere sprecata in solitudine, the voice said softly, speaking to no one in particular. Even the most beautiful evening is wasted when spent alone. Alessandro's head snapped up. The Italian was perfect, not just grammatically correct, but spoken with the kind of poetic cadence that reminded him of his grandmother's bedtime stories. He scanned the busy sidewalk, expecting to see another Italian tourist, or perhaps a business colleague. Instead, his eyes fell on a woman sitting on the steps of the building next to his hotel. She was clearly homeless. Her clothes were worn but clean, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and beside her sat a small bag that contained what appeared to be all her worldly possession. But her posture was straight, dignified, and she was reading a book with the kind of focused attention that Alessandro rarely saw even in his boardrooms. "Scusi," Alessandro said, approaching slowly. "Did you just speak Italian?" The woman looked up, and Alessandro was struck by her eyes, intelligent, alert, and completely unashamed, despite her circumstances. She was African-American, perhaps in her late 30s, and when she smiled, there was a warmth there that caught him off guard. "Si, parlo italiana," she replied without hesitation. "I speak Italian. I'm sorry if I disturbed you." Alessandro's eyebrows rose. Her pronunciation was flawless, her intonation natural. This wasn't someone who had learned Italian from a phrasebook or a tourist app. This was someone who had truly studied the language. "Your Italian is exceptional," he said, switching to English but maintaining his curiosity. "May I ask where you learned it?" The woman closed her book. Alessandro noticed it was a worn copy of Dante's Inferno in the original Italian, and considered his question. "I studied comparative literature at the University of Florence," she said simply. "I spent 3 years there." For a moment Alessandro thought he had misheard. "The University of Florence? You studied there?" "Studiavo letteratura italiana e storia dell'arte," she continued in Italian. "I specialized in Renaissance literature and art history. I wrote my thesis on the influence of Petrarch on contemporary Italian poetry." Alessandro felt his world tilt slightly. This homeless woman wasn't just speaking Italian. She was discussing advanced literary concepts with the ease of a professor. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I have to ask what happened. How did you The woman's smile was sad but not bitter. "How did I end up here? It's a long story, but the short version is that life sometimes has other plans. My name is Isabella Carter, by the way." "Alessandro Romano," he replied automatically, then paused. "Romano Industries, conosco la sua compagnia," Isabella said. "I know your company. You've done some beautiful work in digital preservation of Italian cultural artifacts." Alessandro stared at her. Most people knew Romano Industries for their business software, but their cultural preservation work was a small, specialized division that few outside academic circles ever heard about. "You know about our heritage projects?" "Certo," Isabella said. "Your digitization of the Medici archives was groundbreaking. I actually wrote a paper about it for a conference in Rome back when I was still in academia." "Dio mio," Alessandro whispered. "My God! What conference?" "The International Symposium on Digital Humanity. It was held at the Sapienza University. I presented on digital preservation as cultural memory, bridging past and future." Alessandro's mouth fell open. He had been at that conference. He had sponsored that conference. I was there, he said quietly. I remember that presentation. The speaker was a graduate student from the University of Florence. Isabella finished. Isabella Carter. That was me. The silence stretched between them as Alessandro processed this information. The woman sitting on these steps asking for nothing, owning nothing, was the same scholar who had given one of the most insightful presentations he had ever heard about his own work. "Ma come è possibile?" he asked. "How is this possible?" Isabella's fingers traced the cover of her book. "After I finished my doctorate, I got a position at Georgetown University. I was happy. I had an apartment, a career, a future. But then my mother got sick. Alzheimer's. I moved back to take care of her, used my savings for her treatment. When she passed, I discovered she had taken out loans against the house to pay for experimental treatments. I lost everything. Mi dispiace tanto," Alessandro said softly. "I'm so sorry." "Grazie," Isabella replied. "I tried to get back into academia, but the gap in my CV, the lack of a permanent address, it made things difficult. I've been working temporary jobs when I can find them, but," she gestured around her, "here I am." Alessandro looked at this woman, this brilliant, educated, cultured woman, and felt something break inside his chest. "What are you reading now?" Isabella held up the book, La Divina Commedia. "I find comfort in Dante's journey through darkness toward light. It reminds me that even in the deepest despair, there can be hope for redemption." "Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita," Alessandro quoted softly. "Mi ritrovai per una selva oscura," Isabella continued. "In the middle of our life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood. It feels appropriate." Alessandro felt tears prick his eyes. This woman, living on the streets, was quoting Dante with more understanding and feeling than most of his university professors ever had. "Isabella, I have to ask you something, and please don't think I'm being condescending, but would you be willing to come to dinner with me, as my guest?" Isabella studied his face carefully. "Why?" "Because," Alessandro said, "I think I need to hear more of your story, and because I think you might be the answer to something I've been trying to figure out for years." "Che cosa intende?" Isabella asked. Alessandro pulled out his phone and showed her a photo. "This is my grandmother, Lucia Romano. She died when I was 12, but before she passed, she made me promise something. She said that if I ever became successful, I should use my success to help scholars and artists who had lost their way. She believed that education and culture were the most precious things we could preserve." He looked back at Isabella. "I've been trying to honor that promise by funding scholarships and cultural programs, but I never felt like I was doing enough. Meeting you tonight, I think she would have wanted me to meet you." Isabella was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman." "Era una donna straordinaria," Alessandro said. "She was an extraordinary woman, just like you." Isabella stood slowly, gathering her few possessions. "I should warn you, I don't have anything suitable for a nice restaurant." "Non importa," Alessandro said. "It doesn't matter. We'll figure it out." As they walked toward the hotel, Alessandro couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was more than coincidence. "Isabella, what would you say if I told you I have a proposition for you?" "Che tipo di proposta?" she asked carefully. "I need someone to head our cultural preservation division. Someone who understands both the technical aspects and the cultural significance of what we're trying to preserve. Someone who can bridge the gap between technology and humanity." Isabella stopped walking. "Are you offering me a job?" "Sto offrendo una possibility," Alessandro said. "I'm offering you a chance to use your knowledge, your passion, your understanding of culture to help preserve it for future generations." "But I'm homeless," Isabella said quietly. "I don't have professional clothes, I don't have references." "Hai qualcosa di più importante," Alessandro interrupted. "You have something more important. You have knowledge, passion, and perspective that money can't buy. The clothes, the apartment, the practical things. Those are easy to solve. Finding someone who truly understands what we're trying to accomplish, that's nearly impossible." Isabella looked at him with tears in her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" "Because," Alessandro said, My grandmother always told me that culture doesn't belong to the wealthy. It belongs to everyone. And sometimes the people who understand it best are the ones who have lost everything else. Over dinner at a quiet restaurant near the hotel, Alessandro listened as Isabella shared more of her story. She spoke about her childhood in Detroit, her mother's sacrifices to send her to college, her excitement at being accepted to study in Florence. She talked about her research, her discoveries, her dreams of making literature and art accessible to everyone. La cultura è come l'acqua, Isabella said as they finished their meal. Culture is like water. It finds its way to where it's needed most, but sometimes it needs help flowing. Exactamente, Alessandro agreed. Exactly. And I think you know how to help it flow. When would you need an answer? Isabella asked. Alessandro smiled. I don't need an answer. I need a partner, someone who can help me honor my grandmother's promise while doing something meaningful for the world. Sua nonna sarebbe orgogliosa, Isabella said softly. Your grandmother would be proud. The next morning, Alessandro's assistant was surprised to receive instructions to prepare a first-class ticket to Milan, arrange temporary housing, and begin the process of setting up a new division of the company. By the end of the week, Isabella Carter was on a plane to Italy, carrying nothing but her worn copy of Dante and a letter of employment that would change both their lives. 6 months later, under Isabella's leadership, Romano Industries' Cultural Preservation Division had become one of the most respected programs in Europe. Universities competed to work with them, and Isabella's insights had revolutionized how they approached digital archive. But the real success was measured in something more personal. Every evening, Alessandro would receive a text message from Isabella, usually a line of poetry or a cultural observation, always written in Italian. And every time he would think of his grandmother and know that her promise had finally been fulfilled. Because sometimes, the most important conversations happen between strangers on a sidewalk, and sometimes, the most valuable treasures are found in the most unexpected places. La verità è che ogni persona che incontriamo ha qualcosa da insegnarci, Isabella had said on that first night. The truth is that every person we meet has something to teach us. Alessandro had learned that lesson well, and now, every time he passed a homeless person on the street, he remembered that behind every story of hardship might be a story of brilliance waiting to be discovered. The culture they had set out to preserve had in the end preserved them both. But the story doesn't end there. 1 year later, Isabella stood before the European Council of Ministers, presenting Romano Industries' latest breakthrough, a revolutionary system that could digitally preserve cultural artifacts in ways previously thought impossible. The technology had been her idea, inspired by her years of studying how art and literature survive through generations of hardship. La cultura non è un lusso, Isabella addressed the assembly in perfect Italian. Culture is not a luxury, it is the foundation upon which civilization builds its future. In the audience, Alessandro watched with tears in his eyes as the woman who had once lived on the streets received a standing ovation from some of the most powerful cultural leaders in Europe. The scholarship program they had launched together had already helped 50 displaced scholars find new paths, and universities across 3 continents were adopting their preservation methods. That evening, at the celebration dinner, Isabella found a quiet moment to call her mentor. Alessandro, I have something to tell you. Dimmi tutto, he replied. I've been offered a position at UNESCO. They want me to head their global digital preservation initiative. Alessandro felt a omen of panic. He couldn't imagine the company without her. But then he remembered his grandmother's words about letting beautiful things flourish wherever they were meant to be. An opportunity incredibile, he said. It's an incredible opportunity. I want to take it, Isabella said, but only if we can structure it as a partnership. Romano Industries and UNESCO, working together to preserve culture worldwide. Alessandro smiled. My grandmother always said that the best business partnerships are built on shared values, not shared profits. Allora è deciso, Isabella said. Then it's decided. 3 months later, the Romano UNESCO Cultural Preservation Initiative was launched with Isabella as its director. The program would eventually preserve the cultural heritage of 12 countries, train over 200 young scholars, and create a digital archive that scholars would use for generations. But on quiet evenings when Isabella walked through the streets of Geneva or Rome or New York, she always remembered that first conversation outside the hotel. She carried the same worn copy of Dante, though now it was accompanied by a leather briefcase and the respect of the international community. And Alessandro, whenever he passed someone on the street who looked like they might need help, would stop and ask if they needed anything, because he had learned that sometimes the most important conversations happen between strangers, and sometimes the most valuable treasures are found in the most unexpected places. The promise made by an Italian grandmother to her grandson had grown into something neither of them could have imagined, a movement that proved culture belongs to everyone and that brilliance can emerge from the darkest circumstances. Ogni persona ha una storia da raccontare, Isabella often said in her speeches. Every person has a story to tell. The tragedy is not that people fall, it's that we stop listening to their story. And so the culture they had set out to preserve had, in the end, preserved them both, and countless others, whose stories were waiting to be heard. 3 years had passed since that first encounter outside the hotel. The Romano UNESCO Cultural Preservation Initiative had become internationally recognized, with Isabella as its director. She had spoken at conferences across Europe, and her work had helped dozens of displaced scholars find new paths. Alessandro had established the Lucia Romano Foundation in his grandmother's honor, with Isabella leading its academic programs. The foundation provided scholarships to talented individuals whose circumstances had hidden their ability. La cultura viaggia con le persone, Isabella would tell her students. Culture travels with people. It doesn't need museums to survive, it needs human connection. The program had discovered remarkable minds in unexpected places. Michael Stevens, a former chemistry professor who had been homeless for 3 years, was now leading research at UC Berkeley after Isabella found him solving equations in the sand at Venice Beach. Maria Santos, a Venezuelan concert pianist, had been playing broken keyboards in subway stations before the foundation helped her secure a position with the Los Angeles Philharmonic. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Isabella was walking through Central Park in New York. She had returned to the city for a board meeting and found herself drawn to the same neighborhood where she had once lived on the streets. As she passed a familiar corner, she saw a young woman sitting on a bench, reading a book. The woman was clearly homeless, her possessions gathered beside her, but her focus on the book was complete, her posture suggesting deep engagement with the text. Isabella approached slowly. As she got closer, she could see the title Pride and Prejudice. Excellent choice, Isabella said gently. The woman looked up, startled. She was young, maybe 25, with intelligent eyes and a wary expression. It's my favorite, she said after a moment. I've read it maybe 50 times. What draws you to it? The woman considered the question seriously. I think it's about second chance, about how people can change their minds about each other if they're willing to look beyond first impressions. Isabella felt a familiar stirring of recognition. What's your name? Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. Sarah, would you like to get some coffee? I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on Austen. Over the next hour, Isabella listened as Sarah shared insights about literature that would have impressed any graduate student. Sarah had been an English major at Columbia until financial difficulties forced her to drop out. She had been working temporary jobs and living in shelters for 2 years, but she had never stopped reading. The thing about Austen, Sarah was saying, is that she understood that social class isn't about work. Elizabeth Bennet sees past Darcy's wealth to his character, but she also demands that he see past her circumstances to her intelligence. Isabella smiled, remembering her own words from years ago about how culture finds its way to where it's needed most. Sarah, what would you say if I told you there was a way to continue your education, to use your insights about literature in a meaningful way? Sarah's eyes widened. I'd say that sounds too good to be true. What if I told you it was? That evening, Isabella sent Alessandro a message. Found another one. Sarah Mitchell, Columbia dropout, living in Central Park. Brilliant insights on Austen. Can you have the scholarship application ready by tomorrow? Alessandro's response was immediate. Already preparing it, send me her details. A year later, Sarah Mitchell was completing her master's degree in comparative literature at Columbia University, funded by the Lucia Romano Foundation. Her thesis on social class in literature had been accepted for publication by a major academic journal. But the real victory wasn't academic. It was personal. Sarah had found her voice again, and the world was listening. As Isabella stood in her apartment in Geneva, looking out at the lake and thinking about the journey that had brought her here, she realized that the conversation with Alessandro outside that hotel had been just the beginning. Every person they had helped, every story they had preserved, every mind they had recognized, it was all part of a larger story about human dignity and the power of seeing beyond appearance. She picked up her worn copy of Dante, the same book she had been reading on the streets of New York, and turned to a passage she had marked long ago. E quindi, uscimmo a rivedere stelle. And so we came out to see the stars again. Culture, she reflected, wasn't about preserving the past, it was about creating the future. And sometimes, the most beautiful futures were built from the most unlikely beginnings. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alessandro. Foundation board meeting tomorrow. New applications from 12 countries, including one from a street poet in Mumbai who sends his work written on napkins. Isabella smiled and typed back, "Perfect. Some of our best discoveries come written on napkins, because in the end, brilliance doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispers in quiet moments, in conversations between strangers, in the careful way someone turns the pages of a beloved book. And sometimes, if you're listening carefully enough, you can hear it. And if you're brave enough, you can help it find its voice." The culture they had set out to preserve had in the end preserved them all, and created a movement that would outlast any single story, any single scholarship, any single life. It had become something larger than themselves, a reminder that every person carries something valuable, and that the most important conversations happen when we stop long enough to truly listen. Ogni persona ha una storia da raccontare. Isabella had said in her speeches, every person has a story to tell, and now, finally, the world was learning to listen.